Hello and welcome to the Best Practices Summit. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots 501c3 nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of pollinators. Our co-host is the Xerces Society, a science-based nonprofit.
So I'm Bruce Stein. I'm Chief Scientist with the National Wildlife Federation. And I was asked to talk about climate change and its impacts and effects on pollinator conservation. And I will say up front that I am not a pollination specialist like the folks that you just heard from, but I do have some background and pay attention to the issue. But I have, for the past 15 years, really focused on the question of what does climate change and rapidly accelerating climate change mean for the practice of conservation. So I'll be sharing a little bit with you about that and some of the implications of that for conservation efforts. But I just wanted to start out by saying I'm not completely unfamiliar with pollination biology and pollinators. In fact, I actually trained as a plant taxonomist, did my doctoral research at Missouri Botanical Garden with Peter Raven, working on a group of tropical lobelioids, the genus Centropogon. And as you can see here, there's a really interesting pollination system with many of these Centropogons. In particular, their pollination by this very unusual hummingbird called a sicklebill hummingbird. And you can see the shape of the bill and the shape of the flower corolla matching up very precisely. These sickle bills are trap liners, so long distance pollinators. And so it's really sort of fascinating in terms of the coevolution and the codependencies. I also, and this is just a little gratuitous inclusion here, but point out here's an orchid that I collected in Western Ecuador that was named after me. It's in the genus Telepogon. And this particular orchid, as you can see, has kind of an interesting floral structure. It uses sexual mimicry as a pollination device. So in this instance, the species looks a lot, I guess, like a tachinid fly, to a female tachinid fly to a male tachinid fly. And so that's how it gets pollinated. But most of my career since doing tropical taxonomy and research has focused on biodiversity conservation. And I've done a lot related to documenting the distribution and status of biodiversity, particularly in the United States. And at a certain point in the early 2000s, I realized that climate change really was a major driver of decline, and we needed to have much more intentional approaches for addressing and adapting to climate change. One of the things that really brought this home to me, of course, this was much later, but I visited Hawaii for the first time in the early 1980s with a botanical mentor, and one of the places that we went to was the Alakai Swamp in the high elevation areas of the island of Kauai. It's one of the rainiest places on Earth, and one of the areas that is really still largely intact. Most of the Hawaiian Islands, as many of you will know, have been pretty severely degraded and deforested at lower elevations. At the higher elevations, you still have a lot of the remaining natural vegetation, as well as some of the remaining Hawaiian avifauna, particularly the honey creepers. And when I visited there in the early 1980s, one of the Hawaiian honey creepers that was still relatively abundant in the Alakai was this bird called the iiwi. Iiwis are actually, I mean, they're beautiful to see, but you can hear them too because their call is a bit like a rusty door hinge. And I'll also just point out that this picture of an iiwi is perched on a different kind of lobelia family plant. So I showed you Centropogon, which is a lobelioid in South America. This is a trematolobelia, and you can see similarly decurved bill, kind of like that sicklebill hummingbird, very well suited to pollinating this trematolobelia that is perched on there. So back in the early 80s, this bird was still relatively common when I visited. In 2016, I had the opportunity to go back to Hawaii for an International Conservation Congress. And one of the places that I was most looking forward to visiting was the Alakai, just because it was such a magical place. And I went up there, I spent an entire day tromping through the mud, looking at the vegetation. And of course, I was a lot more attuned to tropical vegetation at that point than I was in the 80s when I just had an undergraduate degree. But in an entire day of hiking through the Alakai swamp, I heard not a single EEV. That bird has, if it's not completely gone from that area, it is very scarce. And so the question is kind of what's going on? Well, one of the things that's going on is that non-native mosquitoes transmit different diseases to the Hawaiian honeycreepers, avian malaria and avian pox in particular. For the most part, the mosquitoes have been at lower elevations due to temperature constraints. And that's allowed these upper elevation forests to serve as refuges for the Hawaiian honeycreepers, disease-free refuges. But what's happening is with climate change, as temperatures are warming, it's allowing these non-native mosquitoes to move upslope, penetrate into those previously disease-free areas and affect the remaining populations of honeycreepers. And I think that's what's going on. And the EVV in recent years has actually been added, unfortunately, to the federal endangered species list. So this just kind of gives one snapshot into how climate change is affecting biodiversity at large and pollinators in particular, in this instance, pollinators for many of these lobelioids and other flowers at the high elevation forests. So let's talk a little bit about climate change itself, because you know, a lot of people see the news but don't track it very carefully. But I guess what I would say is that having begun to seriously pay attention to the impact of climate change on biodiversity in the early 2000s, the accelerating impacts and rate of climate change has been dramatic. And in fact, I guess what I would say is that the projections of how the climate was changing and what its impacts would be has been surpassing the projections and predictions that we were making just a few years or a decade ago. And just this past Monday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its most recent report, the sixth IPCC major report, and this is the one on vulnerability and adaptation, that really highlights the pervasive and dramatic impacts that climate change is having on ecosystems as well as human society. That IPCC report is another alarm bell highlighting the imperative to both reduce the underlying cause of climate change, which are the greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to ramp up our adaptation efforts, which is what I'll be mostly talking about. And this report, the AR6 report, offers an updated synthesis of how these impacts are affecting biodiversity and ecosystems. And it has some various pollinator-specific discussions, particularly what's happening with pollinators from a species and ecosystem perspective, but also the implications for agricultural and food systems of these pollinator declines. So what are some of the key climatic changes that we're most concerned about? Obviously, rising temperatures is one, and the past 7 years have been the hottest in recorded history. I mean, there is no, I mean, what I like to say is that there is no question about the science, there's only a question about the political science behind climate change. There's a lot of unanswered questions, but the trajectory and it is an indisputable fact that we are, you know, human activities, anthropogenic forces have been changing the climate at a dramatic rate. We also have more variable precipitation. In some places, we're getting longer and more severe droughts. In other places, increases in heavy rainfall and flooding events. Increasingly extreme weather events is a hallmark of climate change. So we're seeing stronger and more rapidly intensifying hurricanes, such as what happened with Hurricane Harvey that just kind of blew up into a major storm and parked itself over Houston for several days. We're having longer, hotter heat waves, larger, more extreme wildfires. And then, of course, sea levels are rising. And sea levels are rising in part because as water warms, it expands. And then in part because as ice, polar ice, glacial ice melts, it adds water to the oceans. And a new NOAA report that came out just last week, again, over the past 100 years in the US, there's been on average a 1 foot rise in sea level. It varies from region to region for various reasons, but this new report, new government report, projects that over the next 30 years, we will see an additional 1 foot sea level rise. So 30 years may sound like a long ways off, but if you're taking out a 30-year home mortgage, that means that in the lifetime of the mortgage that you're taking out, if you're living on the coast, there's going to be an additional 1 foot of sea level rise. So many of you are familiar with the analogy that Paul Ehrlich used many years ago about biodiversity and what does it matter if species go extinct? And he used the analogy of an airplane and rivets popping out, and you can lose some rivets, but at some point, it's going to disrupt the structural integrity of that airplane, and it's going to crash. And what I would say is that what we have right now, not only is that the rivets are popping out of the plane, but the plane is flying into uncharted territory, into conditions for which it was not designed. That is, because of climate change, many of our species and ecosystems are being subjected to forces beyond what they have historically experienced in their evolutionary history. So one of the things that we obviously are interested in is looking at how shifting climatic conditions affect the distribution of species and ecosystems. On the right, you can see a depiction of the plant hardiness zones and how plant hardiness zones that we knew in the past are really, being redrawn. From a very practical perspective, as you're thinking about what pollinator-friendly plants are suitable for your gardens or restoration efforts, we need to take into account, the shifts in these hardiness zones. On the left, you can see some depictions of what are called climate velocity analyses, which, and there's various ways of doing that, but essentially show the rate of change in any particular place in terms of its climate. The red in these particular maps being the areas where there's the highest rates of change. And just, I will tell you that the very highest rates of change in terms of actual temperature increases are at higher latitudes. And Alaska, as an example, has experienced about double the warming as the continental United States. So what are some of the climate impacts on pollinators and plant and their interactions? First of all, we have to understand that pollinators and their plants, host plants, nectar and pollen resource plants will vary differentially to different climatic shifts. Some of the things that we are looking at has to do with the range shifts. And so you can have pollinator shifting ranges at different rates as the host plants. You can see changes in population numbers or viability. Often this is decreases, but obviously there's going to be winners and losers. And so there are certain plant species, for example, and many of them are invasives, that will actually see increases in their pollen and in their numbers. There's evolutionary pressures, and there's already been shown to be some changes in both morphology of pollinators as well as flowers. And then increasingly, we're going to be seeing a disruption of these species interactions. And I suspect that during the course of this conference, others have probably talked about these emerging asymmetries, but we can have spatial mismatches where, because of differential rates of range shift, you'll see sort of a disruption of these interactions. Temporal or phenological mismatches, that is where the timing of life history events shift. where emergence of pollinators may not match up any longer with emergence of their plant resources. And then you can also see reduction of particular nectar plant resources. And I show on the right here a chart that Gerard et al. Recently published that just kind of summarizes some of these various things in terms of the spatial, temporal, morphological mismatches, and even recognition mismatches, related to foraging behavior and floral choices and the actual attractiveness of the floral resources for the pollinators. So let me give one particular example, an early example where climate change was implicated in different shifts for the species. And this is something, the Kino checkerspot, which was researched very thoroughly and is still being researched by Camille Parmesan, who really has been a pioneer in documenting climate impacts on biodiversity. And she's actually one of the co-authors of the recent IPCC report. The Kino checkerspot is now listed as federally as endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. What Parmesan found is that this butterfly already is responding and has responded to changing climatic conditions. They've documented, she and her colleagues have documented both latitudinal and elevational changes. So latitudinal meaning south to north, oftentimes we find species shifting poleward in response to warming temperatures, and elevational moving upslope again from warmer to cooler. She's also documented host shifts in this particular species, which is an adaptation, an evolutionary adaptation to these changes. So shifting from plantain or plantago erecta, I think, to some species of Collinsia. However, the predicted future climatically suitable habitat for the species, as you can see down on the right-hand side, is far outside of the current range. So right now, this thing is mostly centered around San Diego and some areas just north of San Diego. But in some of these climatic projections they've looked at, suitable habitat is actually much further north into the Bay Area, where there's actually some other different checkerspot butterflies, including Aedes checkerspot. I mean, this is a subspecies of Aedes checkerspot, but there's other checkerspot populations up there. So in the near term, the persistence of this subspecies has been aided by its innate adaptive responses, but longer term viability of the taxon is probably going to require some more dramatic adaptation interventions, possibly even including managed relocations, or what often is referred to, not very appropriately, but as assisted migration. So another example, let's talk about bumblebees, because there's been some really interesting recent work on bumblebees and their response to changing climatic conditions. As I mentioned, many species now are responding to changing conditions by shifting poleward. Of course, in the US, that means north, or upslope to track climatic conditions. But for whatever reason, Kerr et al. And his colleagues found that bumblebees don't appear to be doing so. So what's happening is that the southern range is contracting because of changing conditions, but there is no corresponding expansion along the northern range. So it's being referred to as a climate squeeze, if you will. And there's been some even more recent look at both North American and European bumblebees at a continental scale that found that unusually hot days, which are increasing local extinction rates, reduced colonization and site occupancy, and leading to a decrease in bumblebee species richness within given regions. So, as I've mentioned, some of this has to do with wrong time, wrong place, these phenological and temporal mismatches. So again, phenology, as I'm sure most of you are aware, refers to the timing of biological phenomena, whether nesting or leaf out or emergence. And what we're seeing is that as spring is beginning earlier and earlier, there's later winter onset. There's a variety of phenological shifts that are occurring, but again, it differs from one group of organisms to another. Think of this, for example. Some organisms use temperature as a cue for their emergence or flowering, whereas others use photoperiod. So think of many migratory birds where there's photoperiod. So, you may have the instance where you have the emergence of either floral resources or insects in North America that are beginning to come sooner than the birds migrating up, and obviously going to be causing problem in terms of the availability of insect resources for songbird breeding. Some of the most interesting documentation of these phenological shifts has been by Primack and his colleagues up in Boston area. They actually have built on observations made originally by Thoreau. Thoreau was a really detailed observer and kept track of first flowering dates and things of that sort, first leaf out dates. They were able to go into that historical record and then compare that with current phenological events in the same area. And here's just one thing that they've found, which is that they've looked at the shifts in timing of flowering, leaf emergence, and bird arrivals. And we heard a little bit about spring ephemerals in the last talk and how important those are to many pollinators. But what's happening in this region is that you're beginning to have the leaf out coming earlier and earlier, and actually starting to impinge on the time available between flowering of these spring ephemerals and when you get the shading from these leaves, the leaf out. And so, obviously, spring ephemerals, evolutionarily have figured out how to bloom at a time when they have full access to the sun before the leaves come out, but late enough so that they don't get hit by the frost. And so essentially what's happening is that, this asynchrony between the leaf out and the ephemeral flowering is putting sort of a similar temporal squeeze on the spring ephemerals. So there's also climate impacts on the floral resources that pollinators depend on, whether the birds, insects, bats. Increasing drought can reduce both the number of floral resources available as well as the quality of those resources. So the nectar, pollen, and host plants, just as an example, the Southwest is in a very severe drought. In fact, recently, researchers have determined that it's the most severe and prolonged drought in the past 1,200 years. And another example is, when you have drought in Texas, and especially South Texas, that can really affect the success of eastern monarch migrations, because that's kind of a bottleneck for that particular migratory pollinator. There's also the problem of invasive species and how climate-fueled spread and expansion of invasives can displace native vegetation and floral resources. And in a number of these areas, including the Southwest and the Great Basin, some of these invasive grasses are changing fire regime and leading to entire ecosystem transformations, which again has pretty serious impacts on pollinator populations. So let's turn now to kind of what to do about this. I mean, what can we as humans do in response to climate change? And this tends to get broken into two big buckets: climate mitigation, which addresses the underlying causes of rapid climate change. And so the focus of climate mitigation is mostly on reducing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, either through reducing emissions or enhancing the ability of natural systems to absorb and store carbon, or climate adaptation, which addresses impacts of climate change on both people and nature. And so the focus here is on preparing for and managing these changes. And my work mostly focuses on climate adaptation, but I can tell you, unless we really get a handle on reducing atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions, there are limits to what we can do with climate adaptation. And honestly, that is one of the bottom line messages that came out of last Monday's IPCC report. We need to ramp up more of our adaptation efforts, but unless we also dramatically address the mitigation side of the equation, we are going to outrun our ability to adapt. So what is climate adaptation? In its simplest form is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but this comes right out of that latest IPCC report. The focus, though, is really on reducing climate-related vulnerabilities and risks. But I kind of think of it in terms of, this famous quote by hockey great Wayne Gretzky, which is, I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been, because really that's, I think, the challenge for we as conservationists. We need to be looking ahead, to where things are moving, not looking behind to where they were. So one of the things that myself and my colleagues have been involved in over the last decade and a half was really trying to understand what it means to do effective climate adaptation, what it means for conservation. And back in 2014, we published this guide called Climate Smart Conservation, putting adaptation principles into practice. This has become a pretty widely used guide within the natural resource management and conservation community. We've developed some spin-offs for using the climate smart conservation principles and approach for various federal agencies. So just this last year, you can see on the upper right, the National Park Service released a new climate adaptation guide called Planning for a Changing Climate, for which I was one of the lead authors and built on climate smart conservation. And then on the lower right, you can see a similar guide that we developed a couple of years ago for the Department of Defense and their natural resource managers, which, and by the way, DoD lands harbor enormous biodiversity, very important natural areas. So, when we really kind of went through this process of asking what constitutes effective adaptation, there are four key principles that I want to highlight. The first is to act with intentionality by linking actions to climate impacts, and I'll talk in more detail about what that means. But in essence, it means you need to connect the dots. You can't just assert that you're enhancing resilience and call it climate adaptation. You have to be very intentional about understanding the projected climate impacts and what your actions can do about them. To manage for change and not just persistence, to reconsider our conservation goals and not just our strategies, and finally to integrate adaptation into our existing work. It's not something that's a standalone that someone else does. It's something that has to be mainstreamed into everything we do. So let's start with acting with intentionality. What does that mean? So again, it means linking actions to climate risks and asking, how will our strategies and actions address key vulnerabilities and risks? And what's the rationale? What's the risk reduction rationale for those actions? And it means show your work, and so that transparency and traceability is important. And that's whether novel approaches are indicated or whether your existing conservation approaches continue to make sense, but you need to be able to connect the dots. So managing for change, not just persistence, is really a key notion. First of all, I just want to point out stationarity is dead. Most conservation has assumed climatic stationarity revolving around some historic, mean of various climatic factors. And there were advances in the 1990s with the introduction of this notion of historical range of variability. But in fact, we're now starting to exceed those historical or natural ranges of variability. So adaptation will largely be about preparing for and managing change, whether we like it or not. And also adaptation is a process, not an endpoint. And I like to think about this continuum of change going from persistence of existing conditions to the transformation or ecological transformation. And, you know, conservation historically has been about trying to keep either current conditions intact or going back to restoring back to historical conditions that we consider to be more desirable from various perspectives. But adaptation, given the pace of climate change, the rapid and accelerating pace of and magnitude of climate change, adaptation increasingly is going to be concerned with determining when we can either resist changes to manage for persistence, because there will still be places and times where that makes sense, when we will simply need to accept changes because we have no ability to alter them. There are some landscapes that are simply too large or some process is simply too great. And then when there may be opportunities to actually direct or facilitate change in order to achieve more rather than less desirable outcomes from either ecological or social perspectives. And in fact, this notion of resist, accept, direct is the heart of a new framework that is being pretty broadly used within the federal natural resource management community that's known as the RAD framework. Again, it doesn't say, you know, that you should use one or another, and it's not an all or nothing thing, but it helps to define the management decision space. And it puts emphasis on the fact that, you know, resistance is not going to be possible in many instances. I actually, a couple of years ago, held an entire symposium entitled "When Resistance is Futile," you know, drawing back to that old Star Trek theme. The third major principle is to reconsider conservation goals and not just strategies. And this is hard for us as conservationists, but we have to understand that goals are the ends and strategies are the means, and that goals can and do evolve. They're a reflection of human values. And so we need to have forward-looking rather than retrospective goals. So just as a, you know, I've got a picture of a Joshua tree here. There, you know, there's Joshua Tree National Park. When you look at the future of Joshua trees, there's actually, it's not looking good, right? Because of climatic conditions, there's low recruitment. A lot of the mature trees are beginning to be stressed. And so, you know, what is the national park known as Joshua Tree going to be if and when it lacks its iconic species? It will still have relevance. It will still have ecological value. Now, I did also want to say something about this word resilience, because increasingly the term resilience is being used to refer to climate adaptation and what we need to do. And resilience is that term, although it's popular because it's a very it's a very appealing term. All we need to do is become more resilient. Who can be against that? But I consider it like a modern day Rorschach test, because it's, you know, it has such a malleable meaning. People use it in such different ways that you sometimes don't really know what they mean. So it's variously used to emphasize the persistence of current conditions, either to withstand changes or bounce back from disruptions. It can be used to imply transformation through maintaining functionality and everything in between. So, you know, for instance, here's the definition that was in a recent, this was from a couple of years ago, executive order, but it sort of covers that entire terrain from persistence to transformation. But in common usage, it tends to de-emphasize the transformational nature of impacts, and it implies, in some instances, a false sense of hope that if we just become resilient, everything will be able to remain the way it is, when in fact, we are going to need to be planning for and managing for these changes and transformations. So from a perspective of how do we incorporate climate considerations into our conservation and planning, we came up with an overall planning, adaptation planning framework that looks pretty similar to a lot of existing adaptive management frameworks in terms of kind of understanding, you know, the situation and then identifying management options and putting them into practice and going through an adaptive cycle where you look at how they're working and make tweaks as needed. But there are a couple of very specific climate-centric aspects to this. The first being to assess the climate vulnerability and risk of the systems that you're focused on, whether it's a species, an ecosystem. And then the second being to reconsider conservation goals and objectives relative to those climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And so I just want to dig in a little bit on this notion of assessing climate vulnerability, because it really is at the heart of effective climate adaptation planning. Because adaptation strategies and actions, as I said earlier, should be directly related to reducing or ameliorating those climate-related risks. Vulnerability, as used in the climate adaptation community, typically has three key components. The first is the sensitivity of something to a change. And so in this instance, you know, if you suffer from hay fever, hay, you know, as a botanist, of course, it's not hay at all, it's ragweed. If you're sensitive to ragweed, you know, that's one thing, but if you're not exposed to it, it's not a problem, right? There needs to be an exposure to that ragweed pollen, right? So you have to understand not just the sensitivity to the change, but the exposure to the change. And then you also have to look at what's the adaptive capacity or the ability to cope with or accommodate to the change. And it's this last one that's actually been most challenging to get a handle on from a species and ecosystem perspective. How do we actually evaluate and assess adaptive capacity? So a few years ago, I was involved in an expert work group where we actually took it on ourselves on the challenge of trying to operationalize this concept of adaptive capacity. And we published this a couple of years ago in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. And what we did was, at least for species, we developed an attribute-based approach for assessing adaptive capacity. And we developed, what you can see here is this adaptive capacity wheel that has 7 major categories, including demography and life history, abiotic niche, evolutionary potential, et cetera. And we identified each of the attributes that seem to play into whether a species might be more or less capable of innate adaptation to climatic changes. So this includes codependencies and specializations, whether a species, you know, a pollinator, for instance, can rely on a broad array of host plants or floral resources, or is, you know, very dependent on a single resource. And what this does is it allows you to, if you can see where the adaptive capacity is lower in these attributes, then you might be able to target specific adaptation actions that could address that. So for instance, if part of the problem is dispersal rate, you know, you might say, okay, well, there's certain ways that we can improve connectivity or even do managed relocation. But if the problem more has to do with physiological tolerance, then that may not actually be an appropriate adaptive response. So let me show you how this plays out for a couple of pollinator species. On the left, you can see the Carner blue butterfly, and the adaptive capacity wheel on the left reflects the Carner blue butterfly's capacity. And you can see a lot of red in that chart. So for the attributes for which we were able to assess, you can see very low adaptive capacity. And in fact, this species has been assessed as highly climate vulnerable. There's been a lot of declines. There's actually been some local extinctions, such as at the Great Dunes National Park in Indiana, where prolonged drought and increased heat has actually led to local extinctions, even though some of the host plants are still there. In contrast, the alpine butterfly, which we also looked at in detail, you know, in general has higher adaptive capacity than the Carner blue, so that's promising. But one of the things that we also determine is that there can be certain of these attributes that are what we call deal breakers. That is, that they may have such an undue influence that it doesn't matter if your overall adaptive capacity is high, it's going to be very problematic. And in this instance, the susceptibility or intolerance of this particular European bumblebee to prolonged heat spells is one such deal breaker problem. So now let me offer, as I'm getting towards the end of my talk, a few thoughts on, adaptation opportunities for pollinators. And the first thing that I would just say is that, again, we need to understand the vulnerabilities of both the plant hosts and resources and pollinators. So it creates this, because it's a linked system. We need to look at the vulnerability of both sides of the equation. And we need to be creative in identifying options that can reduce those vulnerabilities or enhance the adaptive capacity of the different species involved. And those might be new or novel approaches, or it might be traditional practices. But again, it's connecting the dots that's important. And, habitat and host specialists are going to require particular attention in this regard. We also need to seek opportunities to maintain floral resources across the season. And the previous talk, of course, was entirely about looking across seasons and looking at some of these keystone or powerhouse plants, which are going to be especially important. But we also need to bring some climate considerations into that. So using climate smart planting palettes. So again, not just taking into account the sequential blooming patterns from spring through fall, but also looking at the species that may be more drought resistant or drought tolerant, and also looking at their potential for survival in future climates. So it may mean selecting species that are more at the northern portion of their range rather than the southern portion of the range. We're going to also need to think about broadening source material. So right now, using locally adapted genotypes is kind of considered best practice from an ecological and biodiversity standpoint. But guess what? What we are going to, unfortunately, need to move away from that, because locally adapted genotypes are not always going to be predisposed to tolerating future climatic conditions. And so we are going to start long-term to looking at broadening genotypic diversity as a way to hedging bets against future climatic conditions. And then enhancing options for species movement, gene flow, range shift. So improving habitat connectivity. And for pollinators, this can also mean stepping stones, right? It doesn't need to be actually contiguous habitat, but stepping stone habitats that might allow for these range shifts and movements. And in some instances, the most extreme instances, likely there's going to need to be consideration for conservation translocations, or the so-called assisted migration. Although, again, taking into account the potential downsides and risks to the habitats and species in the areas where those might be moved into. So let me wrap up by giving one specific example of how the National Wildlife Federation is applying some of these concepts in a particular place. My colleague, Rebecca Quinones, who is based down in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, has been leading an effort to help restore climate resilient pollinator habitat in that important region. And the lower Rio Grande is critical for a lot of subtropical butterflies and birds, I think, as well as subtropical bee species. But there's been rapid urbanization down there and loss of much of the habitat available for these pollinators. So Rebecca is leading a project to install climate resilient native nectar and host plants in urban vacant lots and along roadsides as a way of expanding habitat and creating some of these, improving connectivity and creating some of these stepping stone pollinator habitats, and using a diverse mix of native plants that are capable of thriving in both current and projected future climatic conditions, as well as offer a variety of nectar sources throughout the year. So again, that concept that the previous speakers were talking about in terms of being thoughtful about a planting palette that really covers the entire array of seasons. And I just want to note that this project is being carried out with funding from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation through their support of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund. And by the way, the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund just issued their new request for proposal so if people are interested in really putting adaptation ideas into practice on the ground, I would recommend that you look to that program and that RFP. And with that, we're pretty much at time, but go back to Lori and see if there's any questions that I can answer.
Oh, yes. We have some questions for you and happy to have you here to answer them for sure. You had mentioned changing genotypes, plant genotypes in particular, and I'm sure you're aware there's a big push for native seed and plantings and biodiversity installations and so on. Just how quickly do we need to adjust and rethink the native approach?
Well, so I'm not suggesting we move away from the native approach, right? Because I firmly believe that we need to be making use of native species rather than using non-native species. But what I'm suggesting is that, again, the notion of locally adapted genotypes, locally adapted to what? These are genotypes that have been adapted over many years to local climatic conditions. And those local climatic conditions, in many instances, are either no longer there or will be changing very rapidly. And so, although the concept of locally adapted genotypes makes a lot of sense in a stationary climate, and was a response to some bad practices in the past where genotypes were being brought in from all over the place without any consideration for the ecological impacts. What we now need to think about is what the genetic composition of our native species are relative to future climatic conditions. So it may be, for instance, that genotypes that are more adapted to southerly conditions may be appropriate to begin experimenting with in more northerly locations, because again, it will provide the ability to survive under future more warmer, drier conditions. So again, it's not about native versus non-native. It's about thinking where we source seed and how we begin to expand that palette. And I know it's hard because we want things to stay the way they are, but they are not staying the way they are. And this is the essence of the challenge of managing for change, right? It's tough.
Yeah, so we as a human animal like to have our regularities, our consistent program, right? So how quickly do you think this is happening? It's happening now, isn't it? And we should be making adjustments right along.
It is already happening. I mean, I think that in the early 2000s, when I began to really pay attention seriously to this, a lot of it was hypothetical. These are things that could happen. And then in probably 2003 was when the first scientific papers that really began documenting biological responses to climatic changes already underway. And in the 15 or 20 years since then, the pace of those changes, first of all, the pace of the climatic changes and the pace of the biological ecological responses has just increased dramatically to the point where now, we are documenting range shifts in, I think the recent IPCC report that came out on Monday said that 50% of species that have been studied in detail are already showing shifts in their distributional ranges. And we're already seeing local extinctions, oftentimes at the southern and lower elevation end of things. Although, by the way, I should say, that this notion that things are moving poleward and up in elevation in general is true, you actually have the opposite effect. There's been some documentation of downslope migration because of changes in precipitation. So it's a little complicated. But anyway, these changes already are here. They're accelerating. You know, we don't have any time to waste to continue assuming that things are, that climatic conditions are stable. And some areas are changing more rapidly than others, and some will have greater climatic stability. We often refer to these as climate refugia. And so those climate refugia, where things will be more stable, are actually going to take on increased importance from a conservation and restoration perspective.
Interesting. So I read recently that humans can make short-term adjustments with no problem, but the long-term planning is sort of a challenge in our world. And so in the national conservation work that you do you find that federal agencies and leadership in this country are paying attention and taking enough action to mitigate climate change?
Well, so that's a big question. I would say that the big answer is that absolutely not. The political will to do what's necessary to address the underlying cause of climate change simply isn't there. You can see how a lot of climate-related provisions have been stalled in the US Senate. That said, a number of federal agencies really are taking climate seriously from an adaptation and natural resource management standpoint. The National Park Service, who I mentioned earlier, has really been a leader in working with their planners and park managers to begin thinking about the transformations, how to address those. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well. I would say the Bureau of Land Management, unfortunately, has been much further behind, although there's new leadership at the Bureau of Land Management. My former colleague, Tracy Stone Manning's now the director there. And from what I can tell, that agency has a renewed interest and charge to take climate change seriously in its management of its vast areas. So it's variable across the federal agencies as well as among the states. The state fish and wildlife agencies, some of them are really embracing this and taking it seriously. Others, for various reasons, including because of the politics of climate change, may constrain them in how actively they can step up and incorporate climate considerations into their wildlife and management actions. And by the way, Lori, I should say one last thing to this particular audience. One of the legislative priorities for the National Wildlife Federation is passing new legislation called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act that would put $1 billion+ new each year into wildlife conservation. And for the first time, we have language in that act that would also allow the funds to be made available for plants of greatest conservation need. And so again, from a pollinator and plant perspective, this is going to be hugely important to advancing conservation of plant-pollinator interactions.
Oh, that's great to hear. You're doing great work. In the 70s, it was maybe the biggest part of the conservation conversation to talk about overpopulation as a big cause of a lot of environmental problems, but we don't hear that anymore. What's your take on that?
Well, population really still is at the heart of many of our environmental woes. And you're right. I think that there's been a lot less emphasis on how to deal with the population issue. I think there's been a lot more emphasis on how do we transition to a more sustainable way of using resources, given that the population has grown. But I think that there is actually some leveling off compared to some of the projections that were being used back in the 1970s. So you're right, it's not as top of mind, but it is at the heart of most of the overconsumption and levels of degradation.
We're the only species that is set on declining itself, right? I'm going to read this question directly to you. I have read briefly about an increase in atmospheric carbon in our environment, driving plants that pollinators rely on to have lower protein content. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, so I have to confess that I don't follow as closely the research on sort of the direct effect of enriched CO2 levels on different aspects of plant productivity. I know that in some instances there's CO2, as an example, they've looked at the effect of enriched CO2 on lianas and poison ivy, poison oak, and see, kind of increase in some of the active ingredients there. I'm not familiar with the protein issue. I also know that there's been, I've seen conflicting information about increase in pollen and decrease in pollen. So increase particularly in pollen of allergenic plants, but it's a rich area of research. I didn't really address this, but yeah, the enriched CO2 levels has its own whole set of effects on plant growth.
Do you mind taking one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So this is kind of a general overall climate change question. And what generates more greenhouse gases? Power generation stations, individual car use, home central heat, agriculture. What do you think?
Well, my understanding is that the power generation sector still is the largest emitter, but the transportation sector is right up there as well. And that, of course, is why getting power generation, addressing emissions from the power generation sector is so important. That's why it's so concerning that the Supreme Court this past Monday held a hearing on a case challenging the government's ability to actually regulate carbon emissions from the power sector. But look, it's something that we need to address these things in all sectors, including agriculture, because agriculture, there's huge opportunities through regenerative agriculture for soil to absorb carbon, whereas at the moment, much of row crop agriculture is exposing soil and it is a carbon emitter. And so, we need to address the power sector, the transportation sector. Obviously, we need to do what we can at the home level, and if that can include solar panels, geothermal heating, approaches like that. But it's going to require us to really focus on all of those sectors, but especially power and transportation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Stein. We were honored to have you here with us today.
Great. Well,